agus a córde, díolíh galéir, is mise an Uachtarán, Pádraig go Gaire, Uachtarán acadamh río gan Héireann, agus tá an ásaorm fáilte churamh galéir go dtí teachan agadaibh inniu. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to welcome you to the Royal Irish Academy for tonight's discourse, All Island Infrastructure Resilience, How Prepared Are We? So this is the fourth discourse in our 2025-2026 series, which examines resilience from various perspectives with distinguished speakers, to my right, who are experts in their various fields. So as I said, Osquailga at the start, my name is Professor Pat Gyrey, and it's my pleasure and honour to be President of the Royal Irish Academy for about another 5 days, give or take. Other officers who are here present this evening are Professor Dan Carey, MRIA Secretary, Dr. Mary Kay, MRIA Treasurer, and Mary Doyle, MRIA Secretary for Policy and International Relations. So Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were presented in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses, and they are available on the Academy's website, www.ria.ie. And when your subscription to Netflix and various other streaming services has gone, you can always check out the Discourse Series on that. Before we begin, we have some short Academy business to undertake. Our last discourse, as it turns out, was my presidential discourse. It's a long way from Tipperary to PRIA, which took place on the 26th of February 2026, and the minutes were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take these as approved, and I will sign the minute book after this discourse concludes. This discourse, for your information, will be followed by a reception in the front two rooms of the Academy, and we warmly invite you all to attend. So on the 2nd of October 2025, the Royal Irish Academy announced Pádraig MacFergusa as the winner of the Crean Breo na Gaeilge competition. His winning poem, I Gúm Saharan, has been installed in a new digital display in the front hall of the Academy, alongside 2 additional poems from the Academy's collections. Tonight's reception marks the official launch of this display, Irish on Walls, celebrating both the competition and the rich heritage of the Irish language within the Academy. We invite you to listen to Pádraig MacFergusa's recital of his poem and to view the beautiful poetry on your way home. Now back to tonight's discourse. We welcome our distinguished and esteemed speakers for this evening's discourse. In no particular order, Professor Claire Dupont is a research professor of European Governance of Sustainability Transformations at Ghent University in Belgium and a visiting researcher at the Institute for Climate and Society at Dublin City University. She has published widely on EU climate, energy and environment politics and governance, and in 2021 she was appointed member of Luxembourg's Climate Advisory Council. Since 2024, she has served as co-chair of the Energy Security Working Group of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, EASAC, and the working group's report on the security of Europe's sustainable energy supplies was published in 2025. Claire, you're very welcome. Welcome. Dr. Juliet Mian is an Arup Fellow and Director of Arup's Climate Services and Sustainability Portfolio, leading global resilience expertise. Juliet leads Arup's internal Future Climates initiative to embed climate change considerations across all projects. With 25 plus years experience, she specializes in assessing and strengthening infrastructure resilience to climate change and other shocks. She leads major projects including a Middle East Transport Climate Adaptation Plan and the Environment Agency's FENS 2100 Plus program, and previously directed the National Grid Climate Change Risk Assessment. Juliet, welcome to you. Sir David Stirling, MRIA, served in the Northern Ireland Civil Service for over 40 years, becoming head of the Civil Service in 2017. He managed major challenges including Brexit, maintaining public services in the absence of ministers, and helped secure the new decade new approach that restored the devolved government in 2020. He also supported the new executive's response to the first wave of COVID-19 before retiring in August 2020. He now chairs the Northern Ireland Electricity Networks and Northern Ireland Screen and holds roles with Ernst & Young, Catalyst, Ulster Wildlife, Inspiring Wellbeing, and the Irish Times Trust. Sir David, you're very welcome also. Our moderator this evening is Brian Caulfield, and he's Professor of Transportation in the Department of Civil, Structural and Environmental Engineering, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy's Climate Change and Environmental Sciences Committee. His research focuses on the environmental impacts of transport and reducing transport-related carbon emissions. He has published over 200 papers and secured about €11 million in research funding. He leads a research group of PhD students and postdoctoral fellows and is an editor of transport policy, serving on several international journal editorial boards. Our rapporteur for tonight, so welcome, Brian. Welcome. And our rapporteur for tonight's discourse is Dr. Niall Farrell. Over here on the left, hi Niall. He's Associate Research Professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute, ESRI, where he coordinates the Energy Policy Research Centre, EPRC, and leads the Energy and Environmental Research area. So thank you in advance, Niall. And finally, to the discourse, I will pass over now to Brian to ask you to be the moderator of this panel discussion. And good luck to you all.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening. As you can see, it's obviously a hot topic at the moment, and I don't think the Academy could have picked a better topic for the week that's in it in terms of infrastructure resilience. I'm delighted to be joined with such an amazing panel, and for once I don't have to answer all of the tricky questions about bike lanes or metros or any of those types of things, or maybe I will, who knows. So to start off, I want to talk to each of our panel members a little bit about your work to date, I suppose the work that got you to the stage here this evening, and particularly in infrastructure resilience. And what are the kind of key things that you've learned to date that you could share with the audience? And Claire, I might start with you if that's okay.
Now? You can hear me now? Okay. Need to check that it's on. So thanks for this question. I could talk for like half an hour about this, so I'm going to try and be short because I know you asked us to. So I started working around 2008 on climate and energy policy at the EU level. I'm a political scientist by background, which means that I'm interested in how policy is made and why it's made and why it isn't made and what are the reasons behind it. But one of the main questions I was asking in my research is whether, how, why, or why not climate policy objectives and climate impacts are integrated into energy policy decisions, including energy infrastructure and energy security decisions at the European level. My study began by looking at renewable energy policies and cross-border gas pipeline policies and policies to support those. And that has, of course, expanded since. But I think there are the three things that I would highlight of what I've learned would be that I started this work in 2008, and in 2026, climate impacts and climate policy are still insufficiently accounted for in any energy policy planning and energy project infrastructure development across the EU and in member states. And actually, this is costing us a fortune in the medium to long term. The second would be that historically, the EU has faced multiple crises that have affected our energy security. We can go back to 2006, the first Russia-EU gas crisis. We don't think about it, it's 20 years ago. But these crises do not necessarily lead to the sort of transformative change in our energy systems that many analysts say could happen. What we end up is doing small fixes, patching the problem, and falling back to a sort of status quo. So I think the lesson here is that we cannot really wait for a crisis to act. The short-term solutions may reduce the more medium-term or long-term resilience in our energy systems. And then the third one that I've been thinking about this one for a while is that transformation at this point is inevitable. And that transformation could be a chaotic climate catastrophe, unfair and poorly distributed, with burdens falling on vulnerable members of society, or it could be well-planned, managed, and cooperative transformation. And actually, the decision is up to governors and policymakers. It's not an engineering issue. The engineering will work out, but the political and policy decisions is where the management of the transformation that I think is inevitable at this stage needs to happen.
I couldn't agree more on the last point. I think there too. David, the same question?
I think long-term investment and maintenance of infrastructure is in my view, one of the things that's really important that I've learned during my career, I worked for a time at a senior level in our Department for Regional Development, where we looked after transportation, water and sewage services, and roads. And again, one thing actually I did learn was, and this is 20 years ago, it's not much comfort to somebody who's been flooded to tell them that they've been subject to a once in 200 year event, particularly when it's the third time it's happened in the last 5 years. So, you know, that was an example of just the human impact that not having a resilient infrastructure has. I also saw at that time that we quite often had what I would describe as a very lumpy profile of funding for infrastructure investment, where you would have a lot of money some years and then no money at all. And that is no way in which to plan for sustainable investment in infrastructure. And without that, you know, that sort of short-termist approach creates real problems in terms of delivering infrastructure that is resilient. So that's the sort of first point that I would make.
Yeah, I agree. I think that any of the solutions that we have to fix the climate crisis we're in will not be done in a political cycle. It takes much more longer term thinking to enable it to happen. Juliet, the same question?
Thank you. I'm just trying to think whether I've got additional points compared to those that have already been made. So I think to present a small amount of my background so that I can provide the context that I'm bringing to this. So I'm a practicing civil engineer. My projects that I work on with colleagues across Arup include what I describe as specialist climate resilience advice, so infrastructure, organisations and clients around the world, including in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, who are seeking to understand better the climate change hazards and what that means for their infrastructure, the vulnerability of the infrastructure assets and systems that they have, and therefore understand the risks so that it can make informed decision making. But as well as that, contributing into major projects, so infrastructure that is being built and delivered at the moment, whether that's for the environmental impact assessment to help demonstrate the climate resilience of that project, or actually inputting into the design. So those are the projects that I deliver working with clients and with project teams. But the third part is actually, as a director in Arup, working to get our own house in order, because we need to transform. Claire's already talked about transformation. As engineers, we use the phrase, the future is not what we thought it would be. We need to change what we do, and we need to actually provide our 18,000 plus engineers working across the world with the guidance and the tools and the data to consider the impact of climate change at a pace that's not moving fast enough at the moment. So I suppose from that experience, the three sort of lessons I would bring into this conversation. One is there is no silver bullet anywhere. There's not one organisation anywhere in the world who's sorted this. I think funding is important, and obviously there are some with more money than others. I think we can't do this on our own, and whether that's us as engineers and consulting engineers, or whether it's infrastructure owners and operators or governments, there's no island where if one part of resilience is okay, you'll be fine, whether that's the last mile or the flood impacting every part of our system. So we can't do any of this on our own. And the third part actually is almost exactly what Claire was saying. We're not transforming fast enough. We will have some of these changes happen to us through extreme events that we have to react to if we don't get on top of the agenda and start moving things forward.
Again, fantastic points, and I would perhaps add one in terms of engineering and civil engineering. We need to teach better these types of solutions and talk about the urgency more, and also get engineers working with people from outside of the engineering school to look at some of the solutions that are there. I'm going to be boring now and go this way again for questions to give the last speaker a bit of a break. So Claire, last year you were a part of a report that looked at cross-border infrastructure for integration and efficiency. With the rising national kind of sovereignty and geopolitical resilience, like, how can we better set up our systems, and what did that report, and what could policymakers here in Ireland learn from that report and beyond?
So this is a really interesting question. That report was really focused at an EU level, and I think Often when you speak in an Irish context, you hear quite a lot that Ireland is kind of special, it's not the same as other EU countries, but I still think that the findings that we come to are valid for Ireland as well. So the main finding of the EASAC report is that a secure energy system is a predominantly fossil-free energy system, and that applies for Ireland too. Because the reliance that European countries have on fossil imports, it's costing us a lot. It exposes us to vulnerabilities and price shocks. It exposes us to supply shocks, and we see this happening today again in 2026, not just a few years since the previous energy crisis. So this report is also not a new finding. It's relying on reviewing the knowledge of scientists and researchers that have already produced this work for many years. So that finding is still valid in an Irish context. So if you think about that for what that means for infrastructure, that means that the policy of moving towards electrification based on a renewable and sustainable energy system is the right way to go. But that, of course, requires grid infrastructure as a kind of a means to ensure that we have sufficient supply when it's needed. And that is far easier to achieve on the European continental context than it is on an island like Ireland, which is why I think the North-South all-island cooperation is so essential. At the same time, that's only part of the solution. So our report also talks about the importance of grid flexibility management. And for that, you need a governance framework that allows you to respond sufficiently when you have flexibilities in your system to work with your neighbors and to ensure you have some demand management options. It also highlights the importance of storage and the decentralization of energy systems so that you don't have a single vulnerable node in your system, but you have a multitude of decentralized systems, which is also something that can be implemented in an Irish context. So these approaches are considered highly important at national level. They can be governed by higher level cooperative frameworks. Some of those exist in the EU already, some of those exist with partners, and a lot of it is just actually about implementing it. So those would be, I think, the main points that we could draw from that report that are valid for Ireland as well.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I think that the next question for you, David, kind of dovetails onto that one as well. So, how do post-Brexit logistics and energy interdependencies between Northern Ireland, the Republic, and GB create risks that still lack, some robust governance?
Yeah, this is a great question, which probably doesn't get an easy answer. Obviously, I'll look first at the sort of supply chain issue. Northern Ireland is still effectively inside the single market for goods. We have the Windsor framework, which attempts to sort of reduce the friction that naturally flows from that. But the reality is Northern Ireland is really reliant on regulations that are determined between Dublin, Belfast, London, and Brussels. High levels of complexity, and we still don't have a fully mature, permanently simplified regime for handling disruption to food, animal health inputs, medicines, and other controlled goods. Excuse me, when the supply chain sort of emanates from the UK or from GB, but legally intersects with EU rules in Northern Ireland. And part of our problem is that many of the political players who've been involved in the sort of discussions and negotiations that have led us to where we are today haven't been totally transparent and honest about just what's actually really happening on the ground. So, we still are dealing with difficult issues there, which are going to require political leadership. So that remains definitely a big issue in terms of needing stronger governance framework. I suppose the second area then, and picking up on some of the points Claire was making, just looking at energy and particularly at electricity. The single electricity market is unique in European terms. It works pretty well, but we're not able to avail of the sort of relationships, the market that there is in the wider EU. and I think we're missing opportunities there for electricity trading, regulatory alignment, dispute handling, investment, etc. And there's more that could be done, which is going to, again, require political goodwill on a lot of sides. Excuse me. The third area then is just, it's a more practical one, and it's about infrastructure. And this, I'm going to mention the fact that it still lack a good interconnection north and south for electricity. And I can first remember discussions about the second north-south interconnector maybe as much as 20 years ago. And we're still a long way from that. And that's probably causing consumers, both sides of the border, loss of tens of millions of pounds or euro. And again, we've got this situation now where actually there's, in the south you can barely meet the demand for electricity, and in the north we have got more electricity than actually there is demand for. So it just seems crazy that our failure to be able to deliver this vital piece of infrastructure is holding us back. And just the fourth point I want to make is just in relation to gas. And again, we want to move to a future where there is much less reliance on fossil fuels, but for some time that's still going to be necessary. And there is still a lot that could be done to improve electricity, gas electricity contingency planning across GB, Northern Ireland and Ireland, because I think you're still very heavily reliant on the gas that comes through the Moffat interconnector from Scotland. So there's a lot that still needs to be done just to provide us with resilience for our supply chains and for infrastructure caused in large part by that thing called Brexit.
And just to maybe to follow up, is there any impetus to fix that? Like you've laid out the economic factors as to why we need the second interconnector.
These are all personal views. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody tonight. I would detect a lack of political will to deal with some issues, and that's in part, I think, from fatigue from dealing with the issue, and also with a realization that it is highly complex and there are no easy solutions. The point about the interconnector is an interesting one as well, because I think it's just one example of our inability, and I say our collectively, this is not confined to Northern Ireland or Ireland. Our inability to build stuff is a huge problem, which may be something worth debating when we get into the Q&A, but certainly I look at the interconnector, I look at the A5 dual carriageway from Ballygolly to Derry, I look at the Casement Park project, we've got a waste management, there's multiple projects that have taken forever. And
I can give you a list as well. And equally a rail connection through Northern Ireland to Donegal is something as well that's vitally required. So on this kind of civil infrastructure, Juliet, so as you said, you're leading the internal shift within Arup to make sure that climate change is kind of at the top of the agenda of all projects. What is the biggest hurdle with our engineers, with clients, to design for something that's going to happen in 2080? So I think the biggest example we would have here in Ireland is the Ardnacrusha power plant that was constructed 100 years ago. The debate that would have happened around that to get that across the line would have been tough. So how is that working in Arup, and how do you see that working with your clients?
So I think there are multiple barriers, if you like, that we need to be aware of. One of them is, as soon as we're looking out to 2080, so historically, and David mentioned the sort of 1 in 200 year flood, historically we would use backwards looking data. What's the worst that the flood has been, or the highest temperature that we've seen in the last 200 years? For an engineer, that's a pretty straightforward parameter to design to, 1 in 50 year or 1 in 200 year. When we're looking out to the future, we are reliant on models. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So there are a number of models projecting what the climate will do in the future. It depends on what happens globally in terms of global warming, but then it also depends on the sort of regional models that Met Éireann or other meteorological agencies have. And we're in the space of do we want to be very precautionary, in which case the loads are going to be even bigger, the capital cost is going to be higher, or do we want to take a best estimate approach? And there is no consistency for that. So there's a lot of, I think I was saying before, change for engineers in terms of dealing with uncertainty. I think one of the messages that is missing is, if we ignore this, it is still going to cost us money and it's still going to impact our infrastructure. So the need to change, I think in the context of an all-island approach, some level of agreement, let's all accept this risk. So maybe we don't design for the worst possible projections of climate change, but we all accept that we're using the same parameters, we're monitoring, we're evaluating. And another very important change to engineering is adaptation over time. We don't build the thing and sort of walk away and be very confident in 200 years it will still be there. We have to monitor, see what might need to be changed. But we are designing and delivering things for the long term, and I think that's really important. You know, we talk about a 70 or 100-year design life, but we know that infrastructure that we're delivering now could be there for way longer than that. So it's a critical consideration, a conversation that needs to be had, not a hard and fast rule that everything has to be more robust or more expensive, but we need to think about the implications of those changes.
And then what about when you get into the debates around, so yesterday I had a debate on the radio about we should just build another M50, it would alleviate traffic for a couple of years, and then, you know, then we might start building other things. What about the kind of short-term projects like that? Can you bring clients around to say, look, you know, doing that's probably not a good idea, you have pain for however long, and the longer-term solution that we see is the thing to do?
It's always a trade-off. I think we need the projects that will deliver the economic growth and support in the near term, but we have to somehow connect that to the longer-term view. So, and I think that it's always easier when I'm talking about uncertainty. The next 10 years is much less uncertain, so it's much easier to think about that context. But the implication of what will happen in the longer term, we haven't got the funds to need to go back and redo things. I think there is a great opportunity with any of that new infrastructure to make sure that climate resilience is embedded into that. So if we are doing it, make sure it's something that's fit for the future. I think that's critical.
Yeah, and I suppose that goes back to standards and how we employ
absolutely.
them in our infrastructure. Claire, so as we've been saying, that all of these solutions are long-term. They're expensive. It's infrastructure upgrades that don't necessarily meet political wins. There isn't a 5-year cycle on constructing something. But how can EU governance frameworks, how could they be redesigned perhaps to prevent this kind of short-term, kind of reactionary solutions to the grid and stop things, I don't know, talking about very, very short-term solutions here in Ireland and energy and across Europe. How could EU governance help us with that?
I think EU governance is trying, but at the same time, I think we do have a kind of a misperception, because we talk a lot about the costs of making these long-term investments, but we very rarely talk about the costs of not making these investments. And I think if you just rather, especially in the context we're in now, right? We have such high prices, such volatility, and we are like, the burden of cost is falling on consumers and falling on regular people and falling on businesses. So I think we cannot deny that there are upfront investments costs, but it's just very expensive not to do this. I just wanted to read out one of these figures that I got from the European Environment Agency, because I think we can talk about the geopolitical costs, the costs of an energy crisis, but there are also climate impact costs, which are increasing. And if you see their figures, they tell us that between 2021 and 2023, climate impacts resulted in loss of 162 billion euro in Europe. That was mostly floods, droughts, heat waves, storms. All of those things affect our energy infrastructure. You can probably think in an Irish case, you're thinking more about floods and storms as damaging energy infrastructure, but droughts and heat waves have huge repercussions also. In 2022, French nuclear power plants had a real trouble managing themselves because they didn't have enough water. There wasn't enough water. So we have all these knock-on effects that are not factored into our decision making. So that'll be one thing I think we need to think about, is really take proper account of the costs of not doing this, and then make some sort of assessment about the bill we pay for fossil fuels and for subsidizing fossil fuels, the bill we pay for the damage that these infrastructure projects are fated to see with the climate change, and then compare that to the investment costs. I think it will turn out to be a bargain. So this is one of the sort of framings that I find that in a political context we don't take sufficient account of. But you asked me about EU governance frameworks. So there are already quite a lot of EU policies that are often kind of individual instruments that try to incentivize shifts towards a more sustainable energy system, shifts towards more electrification. And some of these are functioning in a more long-term perspective towards 2040 or 2050, and some of them are more towards 2030, so we'd consider that now a bit more short-term. And those include the Renewable Energy Directive, the Repower EU strategy and its solar strategy. We have the governance framework. We have the electricity and gas markets redesign package. There are many others that we could think about. There's all of the climate and environmental policy that is now in the process of being implemented. And the shortfall is not necessarily that there aren't frameworks. The shortfall is more that these frameworks are not sufficiently integrated with each other. They don't work on the same timeline, and they're not well enough implemented. We're in the phase where this should just be happening now. We have a lot of implementation requirements, and it's moving too slowly, or it's moving in too much of a piecemeal fashion, and parts get dropped. So this is kind of the challenge where we're at now, is actually delivering on what's promised. The one point where I'd say the EU still should think about doing more is financial incentives. And in the past, in energy emergencies, they have relaxed state aid rules. They could think about relaxing state aid rules in a more permanent process when it comes to energy infrastructure. There are other financial mechanisms that could be more brought to bear on the aspect of really highlighting the necessity of our energy infrastructure, which is what I look at from the perspective also of what I mentioned earlier, thinking about the costs of not doing it as opposed to just the costs of doing it now.
I think that's a very valid point, that the opportunity cost of not constructing the type of infrastructure that we need is massive. And I recently used the analogy that Dublin is like a house that's on the second-hand market at the moment. It needs to be replumbed, it needs to be rewired, it needs a new transport system. So all of these things need to happen, but in our current economic models that will rely on one single ratio at the end of the day to change a minister's mind, a cost-benefit ratio, it is really difficult. And I do think, and maybe you might have something to say on this, is the appraisal at an EU level and looking past the kind of thresholds we would have looked at before maybe is uncomfortable for them to consider.
Yeah, I think this is also politically, there are political opportunities for that ebb and flow. And I think 2019 to 2022, we were in a political moment where this long-term planning and policy making for the medium to long term was politically desirable. So there was a political capacity and space to do it at the EU level, which I think pushed a lot of member states. And I think some member states agreed to things they didn't really realize what that meant, the repercussions of what they were agreeing to. There was a kind of a momentum. And we've lost that momentum now, and we see a lot of rollback and EU policy frameworks being attacked by certain member states. But there's a certain amount of, okay, we're using the word resilience, but there is a certain amount of like resilience in the EU system because of how it functions institutionally. So even in moments of political difficulty, all is not lost in that regard. I think there is a capacity at EU level to look more beyond political cycles than you have in a national level. And member states and other actors should also try to benefit from that when necessary, and frame the EU policy context to their benefit when they need to make hard decisions.
Yeah, and I think when you see a clear and present danger like COVID was, and a colleague of mine in Trinity, Brendan O'Kelly, used the analogy that COVID was like a tennis ball firing at your face and it was going to hit you, whereas climate change and resilience is much slower, so it's harder to bring the voters to change the people that make the decisions, so it is very difficult. So maybe to be a bit more optimistic. So David, in your recent work with EY and the innovation ecosystem that you currently work with now, what role do you see that tech will have in this space? So AI, the Internet of Things, digital twins, all of those types of things, infrastructure health monitoring. How can these help us to adjust to the problems we have today?
Yeah, I think we can be more optimistic here because technology is no longer the constraint in these areas. If you take AI, the Internet of Things, digital twins, these are technologies which can all improve resilience by allowing for continuous monitoring of systems. You know, that could be infrastructure systems, could be health systems, can be a whole range of things. And that means that in practice, or at least in theory, we should be able to know at all times how systems are operating. I think the real bottleneck now isn't so much the technology, but it's about adoption. You know, I was always told that, you know, innovation, real innovation is having an idea and then implementing it. And I think part of the problem with these new technologies is public bodies and utilities, and I know, tend to be risk-managed, procurement-led. They often default to the large existing incumbents. And it's harder for startups who may have better technologies, who may have better solutions to problems, to actually get a foot in the door. And I hear this repeatedly. So, you know, I think if government wants to take full advantage of these new technologies and the opportunities they bring, we're going to need to find safer, you know, ramps, if you like, for startups. We're going to need to look at maybe challenge-led procurement, funded pilots, ring-fenced test beds, and clear routes for proof of concept to be scaled up to larger contracts. And again, I think we can look to the US and see that they are much better at this than we are, but certainly we do need, in the public service in particular, to find a way of utilizing these new technologies much more quickly than we are at the moment.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and well, I work in a university, so I'm not privy to all of the kind of resistance and fear that exists in the civil service when it comes to maybe thinking outside of the box a little bit when it comes to different solutions. But I definitely know our Irish civil service are very keen to listen to the research ideas, and what you said there about challenge funding, it's something that Research Ireland have, and previously Science Foundation Ireland, have been leading out on these different challenge funds. I was a part of one of them, and they're fantastic. You're coming up with solutions for very, very, very real problems. Okay.
Sorry, just a sort of a point I actually might make as well. There's sometimes institutional resistance to change where you wouldn't expect it. Like I remember a former colleague who was permanent secretary in our health department, and they said that quite often they would go out to a hospital or a health facility and they would see some wonderful new procedure or device, and then they would go to another similar facility somewhere else and they would say, well, why aren't you using this thing? And the answer would be, well, it wouldn't work here. So it might sound a little sort of apocryphal, but I think there's some truth in that. Not invented here syndrome is quite pervasive.
Yeah, and again, I think better connection with our policymakers and demonstrating research through our institutions and our universities to show that, and working hand in hand with industry is also vital. That you can work with, you know, I'm working with Arup at the moment on a number of different projects, and you know, bringing them along and then using that evidence to hopefully inform policymakers that, you know, solutions work. And I suppose the only thing is it's very time consuming.
And just a very quick last word, and leadership in public services that doesn't allow this type of resistance to change. to flourish.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we're coming towards our final questions. Juliet, so we had a number of big storms that happened here, and there was an awful lot of talk about nature-based solutions and why we're not actually looking at them properly here in Ireland and beyond. They're often, the research says that they could be 50% cheaper, they can be more effective, they can work with flood management, and typically we tend to go for the kind of grey infrastructure as opposed to the nature-based solutions. So again, with your work with Arup, how do we look to change that? How do we instill confidence that, that say wetlands are as effective as, say, drainage pipes when it comes to some of the flooding events that we are definitely going to see into the future?
And we love a nature-based solution question, so thank you for that. And I think my other reflection, we've just talked about AI and we're talking about nature-based solutions, and I know this is a complex challenge, so forgive me for geeking out a bit as an engineer, but this is such an exciting time to be an engineer, and the two are not going in different directions. If we can use data to monitor the effectiveness of nature-based solutions as an example. So any younger professionals than me in the room, these are really good times because things are going to change. I think, Brian, in your particular question, how can we convince people that nature-based solutions will be more effective than, for example, a concrete pipe? I think one of my challenges would be they're not very effective at the moment, particularly if they're already in the ground and were not designed for the current flows that they're experiencing and the future flows that they will experience. So if we're designing something from new, have unlimited budgets, then yes, you could say that this pipeline will be robust. But I think we're often dealing with an asset that's already there, something that's quite difficult to retrofit. So complementing that with nature-based solutions, I think, is a really powerful way forward. I think one of the other challenges in terms of implementation, there are nature-based solutions that you can sort of put within the red line of infrastructure, so rain gardens, sustainable urban drainage. But some of the things that are highly effective are actually the upstream interventions in rivers, the measures that will slow the flow for a whole catchment. They'll deliver benefits for transport, for energy, for water, for housing, but who's paying and who's owning those when the benefits are sort of delivered downstream? But I think the other thing is time. We're looking at climate is getting increasingly worse, so we can start establishing nature-based solutions now as complementary to what we already have, and we do have time to see how they're working, see how they're performing in the less severe storms, so that we can see what else is needed. And I think that hybrid engineering, data, AI, some of the things that we used to say would take us months or years to analyse, that now we can start getting that feedback almost in real time, will deliver those adaptive solutions. And I suppose the final part of that comment is we can't not do this. We can't afford to upgrade in any part of the world that has, mature legacy infrastructure. We can't afford to upgrade everything that we currently have in a very short time. So looking for those hybrid and adaptive solutions, and the benefits of nature-based solutions in sense of place, in aesthetics, in the landscape design, in restoring degraded ecosystems and actually helping our degraded nature. There's much wider value that they're offering, as well as those physical sort of attributes for slowing the flow and dealing with floodwaters.
But just maybe back to one of the facts that Claire quoted, and I forget the number off the top of my head, but the cost of this to the EU. Surely then it's government that are paying for or testing these nature-based solutions, and is that the situation? Is it the situation I know Arup across hundreds of countries? Are there any examples where that's happening effectively?
One of the best examples that I've seen, and I think this is sadly often the case, is in recovery from a major event. So reconstruction in Peru after the very damaging floods of 2019 took a sort of catchment landscape scale program of intervention, and as well as rebuilding and restoring schools and hospitals, there were interventions in the whole river catchment. There was planting of trees. One of the fascinating things about that was the number of jobs that were created in forestry as a result of those interventions. So that was a very long-term, impactful response, but it was triggered by widespread devastation and destruction, and it was sort of, it's given hope to the people who live there. So it can happen. It would be nice if it wasn't only triggered by catastrophes, but also triggered by forward-thinking actions.
Okay. I have to look into what the geopolitical space was in Peru at the time. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Claire. But yeah, and again, something we discussed a while ago was when you say we can't do everything, what are the constraints in us trying to do everything? Then what like, you know, if we want to do these nature-based solutions, seawalls, and all of these types of things, what are the constraints in the market here in Ireland and beyond?
I think the most obvious constraint would be funding. I think whilst climate change is impacting every part of our built environment, our infrastructure, and our communities, there are other things as well. So, you know, we've talked about the problem of energy prices being today's problem. So governments, policymakers, decision makers, sort of at any sort of level in the built environment are dealing with many different challenges and problems, you know, fixing and maintaining what we have. And again, we see this in the UK with our Victorian era railway infrastructure. We can barely keep up with what we have, let alone get ahead of that and start investing in the future. So there are some difficult decisions, there are trade-offs, and that's where I think the adaptation, no regrets measures such as a nature-based solution. You know, we're not going to look back and say we wish we hadn't constructed that rain garden. You know, it brings immediate amenity value as well as the other more long-term benefits that it brings.
I would say another constraint that we would have, again, in a city like Dublin that has to do so much work and right across the country in terms of infrastructure, is the graduates that are coming out, the ones that are leaving with an engineering degree, a planning degree, that there's a definite skills gap there to deliver the type of infrastructure that we require. So I've got a final question, and I think we have a bit more time. I don't see Ali coming up to me yet. So given the title of the disclosure, how ready is Ireland for the challenges that are coming down the line at us very quickly? And what is maybe the one or two things that we should be doing now? And I'll let anybody go with that question first, or I can go down the line.
I'll go, just to switch the order up.
Excellent.
One of the things that has surprised me actually is that we haven't debated what resilience means at all, and I spend a lot of time talking about this topic and debate resilience. So I'm going to debate ready. I don't think there is a clear definition of ready, so I would probably say somewhat ready could be more ready, and certainly all the work that I see being done across Ireland in understanding the hazard, vulnerability and impacts of climate change is critically important. If I was to, and this is a very engineering perspective, one thing from my point of view is there is this huge, is it the 270 billion euro pipeline of infrastructure projects, embed climate resilience into those. It's not a separate agenda. Everything that is built from now forward must be built with consideration of designed and delivered with consideration of climate change. I think that's critically important.
And I think it's the ensuring that the economics and appraisal of that stack up as well, and that they're at the forefront, and that I think for far too long we undervalue the what if we don't do this, you know, what if Dublin goes under the sea, how much will it cost to rebuild Dublin? So that type of thing isn't really considered. David, I saw you picking up your microphone there with gusto.
Gusto. I think the thing that would make a difference, a real difference, would be strong, principled political leadership that takes the long-term view. And I'll throw in one example, and I'm sorry it's a little localized, but we are, in Northern Ireland, and I don't think we're alone in this, we're polluting our rivers, our seas. We've poisoned Lough Neagh, which has been well advertised, but it's not the only lough that's been poisoned. And part of the problem has been a failure to find a way to properly fund our water and sewage services. And I'm looking down here and I actually see there's a member of your audience who was appointed by one of the ministers who returned when the executive came back in 2007. I had been working for direct rule ministers to come up with ideas for funding water and sewage services, which involved water charges. The new executive didn't like this. They appointed a panel who came up with what I thought was a very balanced, measured set of recommendations which would have addressed this through a form of charging. That was rejected. I think that was foolish. And part of the deal at the time was, in the absence of funding from domestic customers, the executive would put money into our water company every year, equivalent to what would have been collected from domestic customers. In only our regulator told me recently that in only 2 years out of the last 17 has the company got the money that it should have got in line with the regulatory settlement. So we're now poisoning our rivers, our lakes, and on top of that, we cannot develop in 100 different locations in Northern Ireland because the water and sewage system cannot cope with this. So, you know, I just think we need to find a way that would help our politicians to take the difficult decisions that they seem to be very quick to shy away from for short-term reasons. I think there's got to be some role for civic society, for academia, to provide the cover, the evidence, the support when it comes to dealing with these issues, because without that, I think we're going to struggle to see the investment in all our infrastructure that we really need.
I completely agree, and if it were time for applause, you'd probably get one on that point. I think as well, in terms of the communications and how we win hearts and minds, is vital. It's hard to talk about, you know, wetlands and all of these types of things to get people interested and to get people involved. And again, with politicians, a good colleague of mine said to me recently, "Yeah, nice to have, but is it all that important?" It's hard to get that across, and it is by evidence. But when that's constantly attacked, it's also quite difficult. Claire.
So I was thinking about this precise issue. I think one of the, also what you were describing, David, for me this is an implementation failure, right? So the decision was made and not implemented. So there's kind of a gap between, you can have a decision and that takes a certain amount of compromise or political leadership or both, and then the implementation of it is another step in the process that also requires constant efforts and transparency and accountability. And I think what Ireland could do is maybe not something we mention much, is I think Ireland could really work on strengthening its democratic processes to make sure that we have the robust processes of accountability, but also to bring citizens far more into the transition in general. We talk a lot, I think, in the energy transition world and climate transition world of an endpoint. We're going to get to net zero by 2050. We're going to have a clean energy system. But the process between now and then is fraught with conflict and difficult decisions. And you can do so much with the vision of the future if you don't actually work together with people on the decisions about how we're going to do it. And I think Ireland has really good examples of citizen engagement, citizen assemblies that have proven their worth. And I think it's a shame that those are not being forefronted in this energy transition, in this infrastructure challenges and transport as well. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the past processes of citizen assemblies on whatever issues. These have been really transformative, I think, in terms of how an issue is discussed in a wider public context as well. And I really think that, you know, Ireland could be a leader in the EU context if we think about how to implement this transition with citizens in a democratic manner and making sure it is just. That also ensures the security and sustainability of our energy system and builds towards the resilience of our various infrastructures. And I think too often citizens are seen as problematic. They need to be told that this is what needs to be done, rather than being brought into thinking about how to get there. And I think there could be a lot more political honesty and trust in our citizens, and also that hopefully would build the sort of trust in a vice versa relationship that is needed for these difficult transitions.
Again, I completely agree. I think that's a very valid point about our Citizens' Assembly, and they've done transformative social work in our country. I spoke at two of them, one in 2017 on climate change. One of the recommendations of the Assembly was that there would be a 2-for-1 spend on public transport versus private transport. Almost a decade on, that hasn't happened. And then the second one I spoke at was on a directly elected Dublin mayor, and that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. But I think that model of engaging citizens, but also bringing them with you and showing the benefits, and the benefits is not about this kind of obscure kind of climate thing that they don't really see the impacts of just yet, that it's better, warmer houses, better cars, more efficient ways of living, I think is very important. So I don't have any more questions for our panel, but I do see a room full of people, hopefully, that have lots of questions. And I would like to finish by thanking our amazing panel.